Hello, everybody, and welcome to kind of like a weird medium non-episode of Eat the Rich. So we have a player out today. Amber, our precious yogurt, has gone on vacation, and good for her. And in its place, in the episode's place, we have instead this servant of chaos. Daniel Fox has joined us today. If Daniel looks familiar to you, that is because this is not the first time that I have invited this particular entity into my home. Daniel visited us back right around when we did the first look at the core book of Zweihander. And we talked a little bit about that. And you have gotten up to quite a lot since then. You published Main Gauche, you revised the core book, you published the player's handbook. I've seen bits and pieces of some of the various things you've been working on. You've been a busy man. How have you been since then, Daniel Fox of Zweihander? How have you been?
Busy. I think.
Yeah, big same.
Right. It's been good. I mean, and first off, thanks for having me back. This is super cool. Obviously, it's always a pleasure to be to chat with you. I know we talk semi-regularly at least, but to do something official on Twitch is pretty cool. So hi, people who are here for Eat the Rich and for Adam and for asking some cool questions. It's been crazy busy. I mean, since the last time we spoke, I left the agency world, right? I left like a 16-year career in marketing, and now I make RPGs full time. So it's fun and scary and cool and awesome. And
well, and those are a nice combination, right? Because you don't want to hear somebody say, well, since the last time we talked, I quit my job and I haven't published a single thing. I'm just really trying to live off of royalties. So it's good. It's good that you're busy. You know, I ran into the last, I think, face-to-face conversation that Daniel and I had was at Gen Con, and it was early enough in Gen Con that neither of us were like 1,000 yards staring into the distance, wishing we were dead. So that was nice. It was nice to run into you there. And really, that conversation we had is what started us down the Eat the Rich path.
That's right.
Yeah.
It was an early Sunday morning, and we must have just peeled ourselves out of bed and came. And it's like you have so many days in front of so many people at Gen Con. And yeah, we had the initial conversations like, hey, let's actually try to make something happen. And that was, gosh, last year, almost a year ago now, it seems almost.
Yeah, exactly. So, and that's always an interesting thing for me is there's an idea, I think, among sort of the Twitchosphere where I'll say something like, hey, it'd be fun to do a campaign of this, or it'd be really interesting to try this out on stream. And people don't really understand why I don't just start a show the next day, right? They're not just like, well, just do it then. Just go do it, which to a degree, you know, just do it as it's an attitude. It worked for Nike for a real long time. But, you know, there's a lot of moving pieces that kind of don't go in the background. And this, for me, it's been an interesting process, this whole Eat the Rich situation, because normally I'm you in this situation where normally it's folks playing Dungeon World who are like, hey, we want to do a show of Dungeon World. Can you like make stuff for us, or can you like, you know, help us at all? And that's how I got my started, right? Was with roleplay playing Dungeon World. So it's really neat getting to flip this and do it on the other end. But for you, how is it? Because I know you've been, you know, it's not just Eat the Rich, you have other things going on. How is it watching people play your game on Twitch? What's that like for you?
It's cool. I mean, it's still really humbling and strange, right? Because it's like this. At the end of the day, I think I've said this. I think the first time we chatted, I was like, it's so weird that, you know, my friends and I sat around, you know, a game table, not like where I'm at right now, and made a silly elf game, and now to see people playing it. I mean, not just, you know, beyond the people who just backed it on Kickstarter, but now thousands of people. It's strange, and then to see it now on Twitch through sponsored play is super cool, because there's like a whole different. It's a different touch, a different experience, I feel, with other players. Like we kind of like around our table, and the people who kind of play tested it have a very different perspective on how it works, right? And then to see it like out in the broader broadcastosphere, if you will, to see it around other people's game tables, virtual or not, live, is just like super cool, because it's like suddenly it's like, oh, we got all these cool ideas coming out of these shows, in particular Eat the Rich. And since I started, you know, since you guys started the show and I started watching, I'm like, oh my gosh, I can write this thing and create this thing and make these little bits and bobs and pieces that inspire me. So thank you. to you and to all your
yeah,
friends.
and
It's
so
so
you,
cool.
yeah, you and I have the same urge, because that's what I did for role play, right? I was like, they were converting, I think a D&D game into a Dungeon World game, and there was a bunch of pieces missing, so it wasn't an exact translation. So I was like, okay, what can I do? What can I make for you? And so I made like a custom class and some stuff. And as a creator, I found that really fun. And so when you came to me and you were like, yeah, you guys are complaining about a lack of this very specific, totally unreasonable rule, I made it. Here you go. I thought that was really cool. It's a really nice way to be able to interact with the designer. Most of the time, my interactions with game designers in this space are, I wonder why they decided to do it this way. Or, well, that's a shame. I guess I'll never know why this game is like this. So it's really cool to be able to interact more directly that way.
Yeah, I'm kind of in that. I was when Eat the Rich started, I was in this weird space where I just kind of come off 7 months of planning for 20 and 2021.
Yeah.
So I have this gap, right? Or I'm not developing anything
Yeah.
different now. But during that part of the time, I was like, I got lots of time, so let me make something kind of cool for the group and the viewers and stuff, just to kind of throw something out there to show kind of how flexible the system is. And
I feel like we're either I'm just totally not plugged into the people that are doing this, but I feel like the homebrew scene in role-playing games is really strong, and the fan art scene in RPG streaming is really strong, but there's not a lot of like that I've ever seen like fan designs. Like people will share fan art, but I've never had anybody be like, hey, I made this spell, or I made this character class or something like that. It feels like there's still that bit of a gap, because I really would expect to see either from the production side or from the creator side or whatever, like some more of that stuff where they're like, I was inspired by this episode, or yeah.
Yeah, and I think, and I don't know why that is. I think that if I was to look at other publishing companies, I mean, granted, I'm in my infancy, so to speak, so I have a certain amount of latitude. I'm unfettered, right?
Yeah.
But I don't have to report up to the IP gods, like, you can or cannot do this. And the organization through Andrew McNeil is still small and nimble enough where we can move fairly quickly. But I think your observation's pretty spot on. I think there's a desire, right? Because I think that every person who's designing games, professionally, whatever that means, has this desire to continue creating, but you kind of get chained, so to speak, to the production schedule.
Yeah.
So, and you report up to other people. So you don't get the same level of flexibility I feel that I have, but I kind of go rogue sometimes. So I think that's a big part of it. Nobody's slapped my hand yet, so that's.
I mean, are we in? Because I feel like we're in this awkward kind of, as somebody who lived through the SRD wars of the early 2000s, right? Like I worked in a game store during that time, and everybody who has stories about that time are like, either the company I started now or the company I've been working at now started during that glut because we made these things, right? There are lots of, like, Green Ronin got their start in that period. The DCC, that came from work in that time. But for the most part, there was this very specific way you could implement the rules of Dungeons and Dragons to make your own stuff. And then I feel like we haven't moved out of that space yet. There is still this very aggressive, like, permissive quality to it, where it's like, okay, you can make fan content for, say, Dungeons and Dragons, but these are the very specific ways you can do that. Right. And I think, I don't know, personally, I think that turns people off, because doing your own stuff is a way bigger challenge. But like, I'd like to see more people using the framework of role-playing games to get their start in design, to be like, I made this fan mechanism for you, instead of just saying I drew your character.
It's an interesting idea. I kind of wonder, because this is the thing that kind of occurs to me when I think about game design, is like, I think that and this is just my perspective, is that there's a perception, right, of creating content, right, and monetizing that content. So it kind of creates a special pressure to homebrew your stuff. Like, if you're homebrewing something, you should be monetizing it because you're playing online. And that's not, I mean, that's granted, that's kind of how I started, I suppose. But I don't think that we've kind of left that era yet, at least, of like the homebrew, make your own things, release it online. I think that, DM's Guild is a great example of that. Obviously, you can monetize your stuff there. It's cool. You can use their IP. It's super neat. I mean, even some of the lead designers at D&D, James Ricasso and others are creating stuff there because they're given that freedom to do so. A lot of people do the same thing for Zweihander, we have a community content library on Drive to RPG called the Grown Perilous Library. But yeah, I don't know. Like I have this, I have production schedules I'm adhering to. I have these other games that I'm working on. But at the end of the day, like I come downstairs and I take my work clothes off, if you will. And I'm like, I just want to make some stuff that may or may not be Zweihander related or RPG adjacent, and it never sees the light of day.
Yeah.
But we still make those things around our own game table. And I think that particularly because I don't want to get too wax poetic here, but I think the barrier to entry for RPG design is so low now, right? There's a lot of points of enablement.
Yeah, and I wonder about that, because I think you're right. Like I think that, but I also don't think that that's permeated people's brains yet. I think people still pick up a copy of a role playing game and they look at it and they're like, how did this happen? Yeah. How did this get made? How did this took several people, and look at the glossy cover and look at all this stuff. And I think that there's still a big gap between people in the game store who are like, I'd like to make a role-playing game, but I have no idea how to do it. And then the far other end of it, where you're starting to see things like Zine Quest and like some of the smaller, like the OSR is got lots of this stuff going on. But that ethos of like anybody can do it hasn't permeated the middle ground yet, right? We haven't got to a place where people are like you say, it's actually pretty damn easy to make something. It's hard to make something good, but like making something a little like monster or a new spell or a class or whatever, it's a pretty easy start, but it looks really intimidating if you're looking at the final product.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting observation, particularly about the middle. I kind of draw my own, I guess, my kind of marketing experience. When I think about like the largest growing segment of the RPG audience, or like people who are coming in through the vector of actual play. They've probably been playing D&D for probably 3 to 4 years. And I don't know if maybe that's just like people who are kind of still new to D&D or new to the role-playing games. If that may be why it is, I don't know. But I do know that the largest growing segment are younger players underneath the age of 30. So who haven't had, they're kind of starting their RPG experience much later, I suppose, than perhaps you or I. So I wonder, I don't know. I just never really thought about it that way. I never really thought about like what it means to be like somebody who's coming in to play D&D and realizing, holy crap, this thing is like well produced and there's all this money behind it. And I see like, there's like Hollywood stars playing this game and stuff. And I can like, and you can see these actual plays and stuff on Twitch. And then to realize like, wait, I can do this too. Mm-hmm. Like I don't know. And maybe that's just like, and I think we talked about this before too, like the idea of like, how can we impart our experience upon others? How can we lift others up? How can we take our point of privilege and say, look, you can do this, and here's some tips on how you could do it. I think that being able to kind of lower that barrier of entry for newer players is kind of missing still, perhaps. Yeah. Maybe not for people who've been around for a while, but I think that's...
I wonder if that kind of mentorship is going to get written into games more often, right? Like, because I think that there's a lot of games that are kind of halfway there in a sort of destructive way, in the sense that they say, you can make up your own stuff, you can create your own rules, but we're not going to tell you how. We're just going to say, you can do this, which you don't really need permission from a game to make something. Like you can do it anyway. But we're not gonna show you how. And so I wonder if we're gonna see more games do that. If they're gonna kind of like, especially if we're pushing towards this kind of market around games, right? Things like the DM's Guild or things like it. I wonder if we're gonna see more games that expect you to be given, like basically, giving mod tools to people playing the game.
Yeah, that's an interesting line of thought. I kind of wonder aloud if perhaps maybe that's kind of like the last bastion that an RPG company can have, which is how to design rules and make them work them work on a great scale, right? Is that the secret sauce they don't want to give up? I have a very different perspective on that, just because I created something, and so I still have that kind of young creator mentality, I suppose, about how to create things for Zweihander in particular, but just in gaming in general broadly. I wonder, like, so if I think about like the things that are probably most valuable to an RPG publishing company, it's going to be two things. It's going to be one, the IP, and two, the game engine. And even if we look at games like Fate as an example, which you can create, games around Fate and things like that, Forge in the Dark, you still kind of have to work through the kludge and do a lot of heavy play testing. And there's some transparency there, but it's not full transparency. And I can respect why. I totally get that.
Yeah.
I understand the reasons why, but I feel that in particular with community content programs like DM's Guild, like with what I think White Wolf has been doing one for quite some time too now, at Drive Through RPG, and obviously Zweihander. I feel that companies are kind of moving that direction, or trying to kind of show their hand, so to speak, and say, here's how you can design things. Because
it seems to me like more and more publishers are thinking this. Like when I was doing the first look at Morkborg, there's like a community thing, right? Troika, I think, has one too. This idea of like, well, people are going to make stuff anyway. We want to, in varying degrees, platform them making this stuff, right? We want to give people, because obviously this is something that you and I have in common. It's much easier to adapt something existing, right? Take a thing that already exists that you want to be different, and then adjust that thing in a way that creates a product that you want, right? Creates the final result. And I think that encouraging people to tinker with the games and treating games more like toolkits is going to ultimately give us more designers down the line. Which isn't to say that there aren't already people saying like, I don't need anybody's permission. I made this game in 20 minutes. There's no art. I think maybe it's playable. You could give me $1 or don't. Here's the game. I think there's room for brave people like that who are just like, I don't know, I had a theory and I made it into a 3-page PDF. So I think it's an exciting time. And I like the idea of encouraging more people to like design stuff and to make things, whether they're, a publisher or a game designer or whatever. I think eventually we all end up tinkering with the systems that we play with.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think in particular, I think Morkborg is a good call out there. One, because it's an amazing game. First off, it's so incredible. The aesthetic's really cool. I like what they're doing with the kind of like the creator stuff. I think it's smart. I think that other programs, Troika is a good example of that too, where they're kind of like it's a community where they're kind of self-creating a lot of things around that as well. Although kind of within their Discord or wherever else it may be. Mm-hmm. I think the big challenge that they'll run into is that because audiences, like RPG audiences, they're in one of two places. They're either learning about games on Twitter, which are younger audiences, or they're entrenched and they're talking about games on Facebook. So if you create this thing, right? Like I'll give you a good example. So when I was like, I wanted to create an open content program for Zweihander. This is 3 years ago, before I even was like super serious about publishing. I was like, well, I can build a website and I can like promote it and do all this stuff. But what I had to realize is that, where people are talking about RPGs is on social media, for one, and two, they're going to Drive Through RPG. That's where digital products are being distributed. And this is like in the very, very early days of Dungeon Masters Guild. So and they didn't bring on publishers quickly by any means. It was a very small handful of publishers. So when I was thinking around how can I create points of enablement like that, I looked at Dungeon Masters Guild and I was like, I want to do that, but I need to do it on Drive Through RPG.
Yeah.
But you can't, not everybody gets that opportunity on Drive Through RPG unless you have a large enough audience. So there was a lot of work that went into building awareness.
Yeah.
To be able to do a program like that.
We could get into a big long conversation about the differences between like Drive Through and kind of the rise of itch. But like that's such inside baseball that like everybody would be like, nobody cares. But this isn't breakfast at Gamma, Adam. We're leaving. So we'll save that one. But yeah, it's an interesting ecosystem, and it's, I guess the question that I want to bring it back around to actual play and stuff, because I think that what we're doing with Zweihander, certainly for me, is unique, not for lack of trying, but I think that we have this idea. So the RPG kind of publishing world is either Dungeons and Dragons, right? Wizards of the Coast, maybe Pathfinder, right? Maybe Paizo, maybe a couple of other like bigger companies. And then just it feels like sometimes just like nothing, like just a vast wasteland, like the drop off of audience. It can feel this way, drop off of audience and player base and all of that. It can feel like there's D&D or there's nothing, right? There's just like these other little games. But I think I'm starting to see more. And I think what makes this show possible is the rise of the medium guy, right? Like there's tons and tons of people making a little RPG for like the 10 people that they know, and they're all playing and doing game jams and stuff. And then there's D&D, but I think the rise of the middle-sized game company is a fairly modern or fairly recent event, like last 5 years or so. And I think that's quite cool. But as a publisher of that size, what do you go looking for when you want to like partner up with somebody making content, or when you're watching the show? What kinds of things are interesting to you, or what kinds of things are you looking for when you watch Zweihander shows, whether they're sponsored or otherwise?
Yeah. So I think that, one thing that's probably, I think, key really is that understanding that building awareness is tough for RPGs. Like, I think that because we have a lot of like middle grade publishers who have a lot of really cool and interesting IP, it's hard to get noticed, and that is changing, particularly when we see IP outside of the traditional RPG medium coming into this world. So I just saw today, like the this isn't necessarily a new IP, but the One Ring is going to be published now by Free League, which is amazing and awesome.
Yeah, and it's been moved around a few times, right? So the One Ring is the most recent in a string of official Tolkien licensed RPGs that go all the way back to what, MERP, I think was the first. I mean, let's be real. Dungeons and Dragons was the first Tolkien role-playing game.
Pretty much.
Right? Like just chainmail. But yeah, so the One Ring, and it's had a bit of a checkered recent history in that it was published by Crucible, I think, and then republished. They did a revised edition very subtly, and then I guess it's been moved again.
Yeah, I mean, IP is moving back and forth. We have a lot of not D&D games coming in, and I think that the way that publishers are seeing it is that IP is the key to gaining awareness, because you automatically have an audience built in, right? It's like if you want to make a 25 millimeter figure game around Skyrim, right? License Skyrim. Modifius is doing that.
Yeah.
And they handle IP with Masterclass. But I think it speaks to, once again, around when publishers look at how they can get attention around their games, awareness is the biggest challenge. And I feel, and you've certainly said this before online, like publishers have to recognize that part of their budgets have to be for sponsored play. And when I think about like what a good matchup is, it's finding personalities who match, in my case, match my own personal beliefs, my own values.
Yeah.
That's key. That match the values of the game, and can reflect that in a constructive way. Because my expectation is never that any sort of sponsored actual play will be perfect. Yeah. In fact, I hope it's imperfect, because it helps me as a creator and our entire team start to see gaps, right? It's like, here's opportunity for us to improve things in the next iteration of the game that we do again. Yeah. So I think that not only is it just an opportunity to kind of like say, hey, here's this cool game that people are playing and seem to be enjoying, but it's also an opportunity for us to do super hyper focused, I hate to call it playtesting because it's post-publication, but it does help us kind of recognize how different people play games.
We need a new word for that, because I guarantee that is what has been happening inside the halls of Wizards of the Coast for the last 3 years, where it's like we're getting, and I know I've heard people at Wizards mention this before, and other game designers, it's like you're getting feedback that is a very particular thing that is not even available during playtesting. It's like it's out, the game is being played, and you've stopped thinking about that game mostly. But you're still getting feedback, and it's informing a future design, which I guess is as good a point as any to talk about. So releasing Main Gauche, releasing the player's handbook, I think those are interesting choices, and I want to talk about them more. But to me, what I think is maybe more interesting is the decision to revise the core book, right?
Yeah.
Because I have several versions of Zweihander, and it's been interesting seeing the sometimes small changes that got made along the way. What was it that inspired you to both revise the core book and produce the player's handbook as separate things?
Yeah, so for the revised core rule book, I mean, the big driver was at the time that was produced, it was a Kickstarter thing. So um, we were kind of in a position where we released it. It didn't have all the changes we want in it through a series of kind of post-release playtesting.
Hmm.
So whenever my publisher Andrews McNeil, this is of course when I was not an associate of the company, I was just an author. I was thinking about, well, how can I make this better? So it underwent another round of edits. We worked in 7 pages of errata from our own game table and observations people had made. We fixed a lot of spelling errors, just silly stuff. But more importantly, what I wanted to do when we brought it to market was to produce something that had a better user experience.
Yeah.
I think that's and granted, there's a certain aesthetic I feel in Zweihander where we could have went super slick and polished and flowchart heavy, but it didn't quite fit the aesthetic
Hmm.
for that game. So we didn't work that in, even though we recognize that it's an opportunity for future development. So we knew that kind of bringing that game to the fore to re-release to the public, like it needed another round. And despite the fact that the Kickstarter version was a beautiful collector's grade quality, I really wanted to bring the quality even higher in the production, knowing that knowing that we want this book to stand the test of time. It's 600 blah blah pages, so
Yeah.
it needs to be able to be super rugged and durable. So we went, and this is really super inside baseball stuff, but we went heavier planks, we did heavier paper, we did different colored inks, and all
Yeah.
these different things. We wanted to really plus up the release, so it felt like it was on par with other published works. So I could put it on my shelf beside D&D and say, you know what? They're comparable in production quality. Not to say that the Kickstarter version wasn't by any means, but I'm
Well,
always
it's
looking for opportunities to improve.
yeah, it's a question of, well, like this is true of Dungeon World as well. Like with Dungeon World, there's only the one version of the text, but we've printed it using 2 different stocks. So if you have an earlier
Yeah.
version of Dungeon World,
Yeah.
the paper is thinner. I've had people come up and say like, what's the difference between these two? And I'm like, I don't know, about 3 centimeters. Like I don't,
Paperweight. Yeah.
that's it. Like the text is the same, but the product shifts over time. Yeah. I wonder, and I've had conversations like this with other developers, but I wonder if we're moving into a place where we were talking about green light or like early access tabletop games, right? Where PDFs get updated in a constant way. And like, even after a game is finished, you could theoretically patch the PDF, but as long as there's that print component, you're always leaving somebody behind when you do an upgrade. Do you think smaller version adjustments to role-playing games are going to be a thing that we're going to see more of? Or do you think the fact that it's still predominantly like a print-based media we're going to see more of the sort of point version updates, right? Edition cycles and that kind of stuff.
That's a great observation and a really good question. I feel this is kind of happening already, but not in like an official capacity.
Yeah.
I'll give you a good example. So Cubicle 7, who prints Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition and unfortunately lost the license for the One Ring for Lord of the Rings. One thing they were doing in their production schedule back when Andy Law was still with them, they would utilize the Discord to gather feedback live about the PDF before they poured it off to the printer.
Yeah.
Because the whole pre-media process to print a book is about 4 months, like a production schedule.
Yeah.
And that's assuming everything's perfect. So they would kind of release the PDF and say, okay, gang, help us identify gaps or misspellings or any things our editors or proofers missed. And they have that kind of ongoing feedback. And I feel it, in particular with the rise of Roll20, which is amazing, is that you have the opportunity to patch digital versions, but you'll always have that gap of people who do print versions, because the bottom line is some people do not play online. They play only with physical books around the game table, and that's the tension.
It's so funny because on the one hand, I'm like, that's ludicrous. Like I could still play so many role-playing games if I didn't have any physical copies, but I still keep buying physical books. Like I cannot stop myself. Yeah. And even though I buy them and I never read them in physical form and I just put them down somewhere and look at them occasionally, I still have that urge to like have them, to have the physical thing. And I think that there are certain aesthetic things you can only do in print, right? Like Morkborg, I showed off the PDF, but like they have spot gloss on some of the pages and like they're doing all the fancy tricks. And I think that there are lessons that you can impart that are only, I mean, this is probably Luke Crane talking through me, but I think that there are certain circumstances where you want to print a thing and sometimes you're stubborn about it and you never do a PDF, but that's the choice of the creator, right? Is that you're saying this is what I want to do. We ran into that patching kind of issue during character creation for Eat the Rich, where Blue Jay was using an older version of the core book. But what was interesting is that the hiccup we ran into wasn't necessarily, I wouldn't say necessarily like a rules based one. It wasn't like mine says this is how you use this skill and hers said a different one. It was that you had changed the part of the character creation to allow players to choose their character's gender instead of rolling for it.
Yeah.
And it was just like a tiny little change that adjusted the game to make the game more comfortable for the players. But that sort of thing, if I had only read the original book, I probably would not know that you had made that change, right? That you have a better version. So how do you feel about knowing that there are slightly off versions of the game based on assuming that the current version is your vision for it? Do you ever have the sort of George Lucas looking at Star Wars moment being like, I wish I could just recall all of them and release my own this version? Or do you have to just kind of like get okay with that feeling?
I think there's a certain point where we have to kind of recognize that exists, and we have to just live with it. But the way that I found the solve, at least in my mind, beyond just releasing errata, was actually just because everybody who bought a physical book gets a PDF for free.
Yeah.
So I just updated everybody's PDF with the new version. Just said, here's the revised version. Here you go. No, don't pay anything for it. You've already paid for the thing once. If you want to buy the physical version again, great, but you don't have to. Let me give you the PDF. So at least I've kind of made I can feel good at the end of the day to say I made an honest effort to at least get the most recent version.
I think that's all you can do, right? Is just be like, this is the thing that I made. I realized it wasn't as good as I wanted it to be. I made a new thing. If you have the old thing, I still like it, but I want it because the only other alternative is just to accept that the thing that you made has like a stain on it that you can never remove, right? Like, yeah, it's a tough thing. But I think that we still, and I imagine that this will last a long time, but I think that we're going to probably see the, like, I'm going to make up a word, vinylification of role-playing games, in the sense that people don't buy CDs outside of very specific like metal and noise scenes. Nobody buys cassettes anymore, but people still buy records. And so I'm kind of thinking that like vintage RPGs will stick around in physical form, and big, expensive, like fancy, high gloss, like high production stuff, that'll continue, right, as collector's items. But I feel like there are a lot of games that are going to save themselves budget and time and give themselves freedom by just releasing in an electronic format.
Yeah, I think it would. I do feel that there's kind of a return to analog. And this is part of the reason why RPGs, I feel, have grown. You know, the numbers have grown exponentially in the past 3 years. And not to get, I don't want to dive too deep in the marketing stuff, but I feel what's happening on the production side is that people are doing spot gloss, they're doing soft touch, they're doing things to like make their books more collectible and cool to show off, as opposed to the book you shove in the back of your bookshelf and never show anybody. Like books that you could basically put on your coffee table. And I feel that what at least in my experience, particularly with Zweihander, is that, you know, if I look at our sales as an example, our physical book sales are exponentially higher than the digital sales. And that's just because that people want that physical artifact at the game table. That I don't think that's going to go away, but I do feel that the digital only games, in particular with Roll20, was probably a close future. I feel that what's going to happen is a lot of I think OSR, once they get their shit together, will start to transition to digital platforms, and that will help a lot with raising awareness around their games beyond Discord, beyond just releasing stuff, open content license stuff. I think that at the point where we kind of move toward digital platforms where people are actively playing games, Roll20 always comes to my mind immediately.
I'm so spoiled now, and I think I was saying this during an episode of Eat the Rich, where I was during my GM prep. I'm like, I'm so spoiled by any game that has a fully featured compendium in Roll20. Because having it's not about getting up and going to my shelf and getting a book. It's about, oh, now I got to open my PDF viewer. I got to lift my tablet up to my face. Like, if I can't just move the mouse over and search for the term, I'm so spoiled. But I think that to your point, we're seeing more and more like websites and apps and like character creators and stuff, right? Morkborg has one. Lancer has their what's it called, CompCon, their app that they've made. So it's kind of cool seeing that space fill up. But I wonder, and I'm thinking about Invisible Sun in particularly, because how much was that Invisible Sun box set? Like, it was a lot, right? Like prohibitively expensive. Yeah. And I wonder what the space is for that, because we're seeing a lot of zines, like the sort of self-stapled, self-printed, $10 to $20 books. And I think those are amazing. But then on the other end, there's like the luxury RPG object. There's Beetle and Graham and Invisible Sun.
Yeah.
What's your take on that idea of like having the luxury version of a game? Because I think board games love it. Board games do this shit all the time. Is that something that's going to become more popular for us?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a market. We know there's a market for luxury RPGs, right? Because they clearly continue to sell. I mean, if you look at Wormwood, Dogmite, there's clearly, I mean, the $300 set of Dungeons and Dragons, Sapphire, whatever the heck it was, dice. Like, people love dice. They love physical things. They like to have something they can show off and carry, right? It's kind of a tout, but there's definitely a market for it. I can see that. And I think it's what's going to continue driving higher end, like print book things.
I can't wait. I can't wait until tabletop RPGs, until we get our Banksy and we're selling a piece of paper that says saving throw on it for $1 million. And I think I've started to notice games that are focused on like an artistic design implementation, right? A lot of these kind of art punk OSR stuff, it feels like they're very, very stylish, very, very much by intention. Some of them don't feel, they feel more like art books with some game mechanics in them versus like a game with good art. And so I wonder how long until the like total artification of the venue, like until we start doing things like that.
Well, I think it's an interesting, there's an interesting divide, I think, going on right now in the OSR in particular, because there's kind of like the camp of like, like, hey, we're gonna make D&D, DIY, blah, blah, blah. Like very, very rooted in like the 80s and 90s of D&D. And there's the opposite side, which is like, I don't know if they coined themselves anything, but it is the art heavy, less game, more art. I think that's brilliant, because what'll come out of it is like somewhere in that Venn diagram, like right in the center, some amazing game like Morkborg will come out of it and change the game. I think that there are other games that are happening that are like that too, that are taking that design aesthetic and really trying to create better user experiences for what can be seen as kind of gated communities, old school D&D in particular. I think about Old School Essentials by Necrotic Gnome. So Gavin Norman created a really slick set of books that are like heavy UX. But I want to return just for a moment back to the Invisible Sun, the luxury RPG market, because the big challenge I have with it, and I own Invisible Sun, and it was probably expensive, but for me, it's like, it's a collector's item. Cool. I could put it up there and thumb through it, and it's really neat. Right. But the reality is that it without creating something that is affordable, like for most people, I think you box yourself out of a potential audience. And it feels like that's an intentional choice. And granted, I know Monica Games are great people. But I wonder, I ask myself, like, what was the intention behind creating a very expensive RPG? And can you create something that's less expensive to allow other people to play it? And of course, they released the PDFs for $99. And that's
I'm so torn about that in particular, right? Like the physical for some reason, the physical game being $250. I'm like, okay, like, you have expensive components. It's fancy. You probably didn't make that many of them, so your per unit cost is much higher, whatever.
Yeah.
And then a PDF that's $100. And I think there are companies that really aggressively price their PDFs like that. It shouldn't feel to me as wrong as it does. Like, I get that it's like, you should charge what a thing is worth, right? And if they believe their PDF is worth $99, then sell it for $99, right? It's the other part of me that's like, how on earth can this be worth that? In the same way, I think that you see in like app culture, like people making apps for Android or iPhone. If you're making a game, the game's either $1 or it's $10 because anything in the middle is either overpriced crap or underpriced and should be better. So like the idea of pricing, I think even now, and we've been making games as PDFs for years and years.
Yeah.
I think even now pricing is like a confused situation, right? Like it's not something that there's an easy answer to. You can't say this book is 500 pages, ergo this is how much you should charge, right?
Yeah, it's a tough call. When I look at how we price, like at Andrews McNeil, so the way we price digital products, if it's a Kindle version, it's $9. It's every book that we publish. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's 50 pages or 689 pages. But when it comes to PDFs and RPGs, it's still kind of the Wild West. Like our Drive-Thru RPG released this really interesting study. I think it's about 2 or 3 years ago around the best pricing model for PDFs, which we apply to our own PDFs now too. And we found that we're getting more sales from it. It's actually beneficial, but I think that when we look at making things affordable, like lowering the barrier to entry from a monetary perspective, you mentioned Itch earlier. I think Itch is an intriguing opportunity because Itch allows you to, like, if you pay more, you can release free copies to other people. So you're cool. Able to, and that's one thing that I think Itch is doing better than Drive-Thru RPG, which is they're the way that they kind of do that almost like semi crowd-funded pricing model is super smart and intriguing. And I think over time, that's going to where a lot of indie and art punk RPGs will go. And it's happening now already. Troika has a huge community on Itch and other smaller RPGs too. So I'm wondering kind of over time if that's kind of like
right, because what Drive-Thru has going for them is that they're already there. All of your games are already in Drive-Thru because that's where you bought them. And I've seen them doing a lot of development around, like, we're going to release an app for your PC or for your Mac that automatically downloads updates and replaces, like a Dropbox stand-in for them. Or, like watching, at least even if people don't all move over to Itch, or if it doesn't pose like a serious threat to Drive-Thru, at least that threat is there. At least there's now some competition. Because for the longest time, it was like, I got a PDF. I can either sell it through my website, which means you're going to buy it and then you're going to get it whenever I get a chance to email you back. Or you put it up on Drive-Thru and you let them take their cut, and that's how you do it. That's how you sell your PDFs.
Yeah, I think I feel that Drive-Thru RPGs probably, I mean, they're probably seeing that. I think they're aware of it. I don't know how you cope with that. I mean, do you? I mean, is it significant on money? What I hear from some people, depending on where they drive their marketing, some people are like, Itch is more successful than Drive-Thru RPG, and others are like, Drive-Thru RPG is more successful than Itch.
Yeah. It's what metrics you're measuring them by, right?
That's right. And both are valid digital storefronts.
Yeah, totally.
Both have their strengths and weaknesses. So I don't see that changing. But I think that, I question the intentionality of making RPGs prohibitively expensive. How you could possibly grow audience out of that, because that's all fundamentally the biggest challenge, whether you're making a small thing on Kickstarter or making a big dang thing with a publishing company. The question always is like, how do we get people to play this thing?
Yeah, and I think Invisible Sun is a bit of it's an outlier because it's not like somebody came into the scene and was like, hi, I made a role-playing game. I've never made a role-playing game before. Nobody's ever heard of me. It's $250. Right? If somebody said that, I'd be like, well, great. I don't have any interest in learning more about this because I don't know who you are. It might be great, but like, I'm going to need to read some reviews first, and that's going to really slow down sales. But because it carries the weight of the company and the games that came before it, you're really kind of cashing in that social currency, right?
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, I bought it because Monty Cook made it. I mean, he's a brilliant designer. He's a wonderful person. Shannon Germain, the entire team there are super cool. So of course I'm going to support them. If it was $1,000, I'd find a way to buy it because I want to support them. Like that's right. At the end of the day, that's why I make games. I make games so I can buy games. And and now have a job, I guess. Cool.
Yeah, there's
awesome.
that
But
there's that
reality is
button there's button on the publisher dashboard in drive-through that says like convert store credit to money. I don't remember the last time I pushed that button. I was just like, look at all these RPG PDFs I could buy. It's terrible. It's as bad as when I worked at the game store and was just like, it's the end of the month, so I'm just gonna buy all this crap that I'll probably never play. But it is nice to be able to, like you said, like return that to the thing. But yeah, again, like we could have a whole conversation just about like pricing. Like I think one of the biggest mistakes we made when releasing Dungeon World is we way lowballed ourselves. Like it's a $15 or $20 PDF at least. Like I feel comfortable pricing the print version at 25, but that PDF at 10 is like, it belongs to a totally different market. But sometimes when you set your price point, it's like, I'm not going to suddenly be like, yeah, guess what? 6.5 years into it's being published, it's $20 now. So if you weren't going to buy it at 10, you're definitely going to buy it now. So
I can tell you full transparency, when Zweihander was first released, like I super underpriced it because I was like, this is the key to success, make it uber cheap.
Yeah.
And then over time, like when it first released, it was $10. Now it's 19. Yeah. But we didn't just raise the price. We also said, okay, here's a phone PDF version too. Here's the Kindle version. It's all bundled together.
Yeah.
So we were able to justify that. But sales velocity is even stronger at higher prices. But not to dig too deep, but obviously.
Yeah,
just a quick observation.
We can have this other. We should do. I mean, I say this today, but this is also the day that I received the "There's no more time for panels" email. But like, we should put something together for a con, like Gen Con or something, where we actually get to have that whole conversation because there will be people who are interested in that. But it's an interesting thing, trying to choose how to price, and the idea that people will be turned off as much by a price that's too low as they will by one that's too high, right? People decide things about the game based on its price, and they decide things about the price based on the game, and neither thing is controllable. So you just have to kind of make sure you don't bankrupt yourself and then go from there, I suppose. Yeah. Now we've covered, just like having this conversation, we've covered a few things that folks have asked, but I do have a form with some questions, and I wanted to make sure that we got to spend a decent amount of time with it. So what's fun is that a lot of these people ask questions that I think they knew that I was going to ask you, so now I don't have to. And these tend to be fairly specific about the game in general. So Farisar asked, he says, "Hi, love the game. Do you think, given the game's tool set breadth, right, how much stuff there is in Zweihander, do you think that it could accommodate more involved reward point prompts? This section feels a little nebulous considering the amount of general rules text for other mechanics." I wanted to talk to you about this too, because that was the thing that I stumbled on a little bit when I was getting ready. Because the first place I look when I look at a role-playing game is like, what am I going to reward my players for? But it's very loose. It's like a framework in Zweihander. Can you talk about that? Can you justify your decisions?
But
just talk about that more, because I'm really curious. Reward structure in games is like a personal thing of mine, so I'm curious to hear.
Yeah, so our experience, I think, in development, and mind you, this is like 6 years ago, but I think what we really struggled with was the idea of like awarding more experience points for most valuable role player, because it felt like at that point, like, because we're trying different kind of things around our game, so like, who's the best role player this session? It's always the same person, who accomplished the most with their character ambitions.
So
right?
Anecdotally, so as just like an example from a stream game, I think that's true, but on a longer timeline that can shift. Like when we were doing Mirror Shades, we started the show, and for the first like 10 episodes, the same people got the same rewards, right? Somebody always got the, like, you were there at the right time. Somebody's like, you had a good plan. Somebody was the good role player. But as the content of the game shifted, those awards shifted so that the players that weren't getting it at the beginning figured it out, and then they ended up at the end. But it's behavior manipulation, right? And it's very hard to build a system around that.
Yeah, and I think that we kind of landed on this idea of like shared growth, at least our own game table. So we're like, everybody gets the same reward points around the game table, and the benefits I'm going to give them in return, like temporary benefits, are like fortune points. Yes, so now, in retrospect, like it's a gap. And I can tell you, so I'm developing right now for Colonial Gothic. It's happening. It's scheduled for 2021, and I'm actually in that section to talk about how you reward players. And I think that because Colonial Gothic is far more specific
Yeah.
of a setting, as opposed to if you look at Zweihander as a genre. I can be more specific with the way the rewards work. So I feel that there's an opportunity to improve that. I, I, I think in my mind, like I'm probably never going to do a second edition Zweihander. I don't know why. Instead, I would just say, take the original rules and modify them to fit the settings.
Right. And that's a thing that I think we see. Ironsworn does this, where
yes.
the core book lays out how the game works. And then Delve, while it's technically about a specific kind of sub adventure, it introduces a bunch of rules that are like, you can use this in the core game. You don't have to just use this rule. These are rules for the rest of the game. You can find them in a supplement. So I think there's definitely room for that. As long as the systems match up. I
think the opportunity, I think really the observation is to say, reward the behavior that you and your players want to see around the game table. And I did at the time, I didn't know how to codify that.
Yeah.
Now it's a little different. I think that any game designer can say in retrospect, like, I would have done this thing differently, I would have done that thing differently.
Yeah.
Not that it was wrong, but we can improve those things over time. And that's literally the thing I'm right up against literally today.
Yeah.
I was looking at like rewards. I was like, what do I reward people for in a supernatural horror game that takes place in 65?
I think the challenge too is that, like, Colonial Gothic is a lot more like Pendragon than base Zweihander is, in the sense that you want to give players mechanical tools for creating characters and doing things in the game that are appropriate to the setting and the time and the genre, right? So you can reward them. The easy way to do is act like an Arthurian knight, you get points. Act like a D&D character, you do not get points. So in that way, you can encourage that behavior. But with a game with an implied setting, and a fairly strong implied setting, but an implied setting nonetheless, like Zweihander, that's much harder to do. And what's been interesting for me, and this folds into the next question I wanted to ask you, but in the absence of, and it's kind of vindicating for me, because I spend a lot of time talking about how, like, rewards change player behavior. And if you reward players for doing something, they'll do that more often. And people are like, no, people just play role-playing games to have fun. They're going to play their character no matter what, whatever. But in the absence of a clearly obtainable reward model, many of my players, Blue Jay especially, have shifted to corruption and been like, well, corruption I can actively attempt to get, whereas I'm going to get my reward points no matter what. And so all that's left is either avoid or accumulate corruption. And I was curious, like, I'm curious to see what you think of that as a player-driven behavior, or is it merely a negative consequence of play? Like, how do you envision corruption affecting both, I guess, predominantly the players rather than the characters?
Yeah. So I that's an intentional design choice, because I knew that I wanted to have just broad reward points, but I want people to put themselves in tough situations, morally gray situations, to see what they do. And the only way that you can do that, right? So to compare this to, say, Call of Cthulhu, right? It's a race to insanity, which is it's silly, because everyone goes in understanding, like, it's Call of Cthulhu, so we're doing this thing.
Yeah.
You're going to retire your character, or they're going to go crazy, you're going to die. So what I want to do was gamify that model to say, I wonder what happens if people race toward corruption, and what out of it, right? Because it can't just be, here's some crazy insanity, because one, that's ableist, and two, it's just not the right approach. Instead, I want to say,
we've seen this attempt so many different times, right? I feel like that's one thing that developers will go to after they've made their game. They're like, now I'm going to make a psychological horror module for it, right? I'm going to add in something that gives you this Call of Cthulhu tension, which is funny, because I think that sanity in Call of Cthulhu sucks. Like, I hate, it's bad and I don't like it. Like, I think it's just, like, awkward, and the whole game has got problems, and it's funny because people have been emulating that model forever. So it's a trap that I think a lot of designers get stuck in, where they're like, well, how does Call of Cthulhu do it? So
so the idea with corruption is that eventually you get a disorder, but a disorder is not a punishment. It becomes, one, it adds a new power, if you will, and two, it becomes a corruption generating machine. So you'll generate more corruption the more disorders you have, because you can tap into new game mechanics. So I wanted to ensure that if the game is really about, like, tough moral situations and characters are going to drive that direction regardless, then the penalty if you will, is that they'll get some cool new things that they can do, but they're not going to gain fate points to escape death. So
Yeah.
they'll burn the candle from both ends, so to speak. But I felt very strongly like in that design process, I couldn't quite wrap my head around how to do reward points in a way
Yeah.
that would feel good.
Well,
But I
there's
knew corruption was the way to kind of push people in an interesting direction and have people chase after it. Because
Yeah,
they
well,
do, and they will.
it's interesting because I think in absence of a clearly pursuable player-facing XP module, I think that there are like people go looking for other win points, right? Like how do I accumulate the most points in this game? And yeah, I hadn't really considered the race to order gives you extra lives, right? Like you get those are 1-ups basically, and if you don't do that, it's mechanisms having a lot to say about the universe. And I think that's what's really strong about the interconnected systems, right? Like I almost feel like reward points, I could take them or leave them, right? Like if we just cut them out of Eat the Rich altogether, it wouldn't make that much of a difference because we know we're only playing a certain number of sessions, and sure, we're getting some advances and stuff, and that's fun, but I like the things that corruption and fate and order and like all of those things, what they say about the setting. And I think for me, corruption didn't really click until someone described it as vulnerability to the dark powers. So it's not just because I think the word corruption, a lot of people think of it as like, how evil are you? Where is your evil meter? Are you a bad guy or a good guy? But what it really is like how much of your shielding has fallen and where are those cracks to let the chaos in? And that feels a lot more Lovecraftian than, I don't know, you lose 12 brain hit points.
Right. Yeah. The example I always draw when people ask about this is I always say like, well, think about, and I'll use a very kind of common, pop culture thing, Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
So imagine think about the things that Sansa Stark had to do to raise her house, right, in the wake of this terrible thing. She made a lot of difficult choices, and that kind of opened her up to being corrupted by Littlefinger. Mm-hmm. So at least the television version. So when I think about corruption, I think about it's like in the choices that you make in the moment may suit the moment, but they don't suit the long-term arc, if you will, of what is the virtuous thing to do. Mm-hmm. So I feel that corruption is kind of driven by that. It's not about doing evil things. It's about doing things that satisfy the selfish versus the selfless.
Well, and there's little bits and pieces of mechanism in the game that say things about the world. Like your game might be set in a Viking analog, and my game might be set in a Lankmar analog, and the games themselves feel different. But if we're using the same corruption system, there's an underlying ethos in both those universes that make it feel like a Zweihander game, because those things are true no matter what the other stuff around them does. And I love the idea that, yes, doing villainous things, doing selfish stuff opens you up to corruption, but I also really like physical harm and doing drugs and like being exposed to other people's villainy, like all of those things. I like the idea of splash corruption, and I think that's really cool seeing that stuff happen. But I wonder, it all feels to me like a very director stance approach to play. Like I feel like it works best when you have players like Blue Jay and Andrew who are aware that they are making decisions for their character rather than as them, because I don't think that any character, even Littlefinger, would say like, yes, I am actively attempting to get corruption points. They're like, no, I'm still doing good while the corruption is accumulating. I think corruption is invisible to the characters, but is very clear to the players. Do you find that people play that way? Do you think that they play thinking for the character when they're thinking about things like corruption and making those decisions?
Yeah, I mean, that's the way it is around our game table. That's the way we see it. We hear it from other people too who play it, is that they're playing that, that above board director stance, like, I'm going to drive my character toward corruption, but my character is not aware of that. This is like, this is actually changing them. Right. That's that kind of like smack in the face happens when they reach that first disorder. And then of course it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Right. So I don't know. It's weird because I think when you mentioned before, like reward points, you could take it or leave it, and I think that my perspective is kind of the same, because to me, people want to grow their characters. Cool. That's important. It's important for their character to be.
Yeah, I really like advancement in a game. Totally. I like feeling like my character's getting better. I like saying like I have an extra 10% on this roll than I did last session because I put my points in it. Like it's a satisfying experience for sure.
That's right. And it's a very personal metamechanical thing, but corruption, right, has it impacts everyone around them. It's not just themselves, but like in the microcosm, it impacts the story.
It reminds me a little of the another mechanism that I really like. It reminds me a little of the way that panic happens in the Alien RPG, where if one character starts to panic, that panic will spread to the other characters because there's this splash effect. Yeah.